All right. Everybody feeling good after getting some coffee? Feeling a little bit more woken up? I'm taking a little bit of a departure from what I normally talk about. I'm a technologist, a code guy, but something that's really been kind of interesting me in the last couple of years is thinking about how we approach the people that we work with, the people that we're actually creating stuff for, and how to better relate to them and how we do that through empathy. So it's really easy to get caught up in the technology and forget about the people. Man, that light's bright. And I want to find out, or help us to do our jobs better, essentially. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a story, if my clicker works today. There we go. So in the 1980s and 1990s in Parma, Italy, Giacomo Rizzolatti was doing some studies on macaque monkeys. And what he and the other researchers were doing was they were placing electrodes in the ventral premotor cortex of the monkey's brains, and they were able to record individual synapses firing as the monkeys would reach for and eat peanuts from a bowl. And so they were doing this just to find a little bit more information about how the monkey's brain worked while it was performing complex motor actions. And an interesting thing happened where a research assistant walked into the room and happened to take a peanut out of the bowl and pop it in his mouth while the monkey was still hooked up. And what they found, to their amazement, was that the very same neurons fired in the monkey's brain as did when the monkey was actually doing the action himself. And so they came to call these neurons mirror neurons, and they're what allow us to empathize with other beings. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But first I want to start with talking about what I view design as. I'm going to talk specifically about design as visual design in the context of these slides, but I think no matter whether we're actually a visual designer or whether we are a content author, an editor, a programmer, a database designer, we're all designing things. And a lot of times we get very caught up, as I say, in technology or in what's new and interesting and stuff that's happening. And design, I don't know, we have a tendency to think of design as art, basically. And we think of them as being one and the same because design tends to be a very visual thing when we're discussing it. But they're not really the same. Art is very much about self-expression. Art is very much for your own ego. Whereas design, as Jeff Veen talks about it, is really about solving problems. We're out there to try and figure out what the problems are that users are having, accomplishing one or more tasks, and trying to figure out how we can make those more easily solved, take the friction out of that. And this is a great quote from Art and Science of Web Design. So we can lose sight of that fundamental idea of design because we get caught up in kind of the artistic nature of it. But if we look back at the etymology of the word design, it actually started out as to devise something for a specific function, to mark out, to indicate. In other words, to illuminate content or to make things easier to solve problems. But we don't always use this word this way. So David Carson, most of you are probably familiar with. He's been called the most influential graphic designer of our times. And his medium primarily was print. It was working with typography. His most famous work was with Raygun magazine. But in a lot of cases, he fell very much more into the art camp than the design camp. Probably the most famous example of this is the Bryan Ferry interview. And he deemed this interview so boring that he decided to lay the entire thing out in dingbats. So, this did nothing to illuminate the content, right? This was about serving his own ego and him making a jab at either the interviewer or Bryan Ferry, I'm not quite sure which. But this definitely fell into the art camp as opposed to the design camp. Interestingly enough, they did reprint the interview at the back of the magazine, but he still had to make his statement about dingbats, or with dingbats. So this was art. This was his ego. This was not design for the purpose of design. Now, David Carson was, very self-aware, and he knew that his own work was subjective and personal and very self-indulgent. But we look at what his work is, and because he was working in kind of what is considered a traditionally design medium, in other words, he's working with fonts, with typography, we consider him to be a designer, but a lot of his work really isn't about communication. It was about invoking emotion and about creating a feeling, which you can do as long as you're also at the same time illuminating the content, trying to make the user's life easier, trying to help them accomplish whatever their goal is. There's this great quote from Christopher Butler and a great blog post: "Your ego is a bad designer." We shouldn't come to work in the morning in order to stroke our own egos, in order to show off and such. But we see this all the time with things like skip intros, where all of a sudden something will materialize out of nowhere, and we end up with mystery meat navigation, not knowing, not indicating to a user at all how they're supposed to interact with something. And we might think, okay, in this case, this is what's on Toyota's mind, and we might think, okay, this is all right. This is more of an artsy piece. Maybe this is okay, but these sorts of pieces then influence other designers who are creating more, I don't want to use the word pedestrian, but more like general populace directed content. So this is for a Jewish school, educational institution, and they've got mystery meat navigation too. These 4 circles are actually navigation of the site, but you'd have no idea that that was actually the case. They're not doing anything to illuminate that content, to make it obvious to people that there is something usable here. It just looks like decoration. So this is something where something that should be usable has essentially devolved into art. And it reminds me a lot of the Coffee Pot for Masochists by Jacques Carlman, who Don Norman famously referenced in Emotional Design. It's a beautiful piece, a beautiful art piece, but it's completely useless, right? Usability needs to be part of what we do. Just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should. This is my rule of thumb for when I'm building interfaces or designing interfaces. I have to look at each technological concept, each IA idea, each interface design, and kind of weigh it. Is this something that we're doing that's actually in service of the content? Are we making it easier to accomplish a task? Are we being true to the purpose of this page? Are we honoring all of the great authorship that went into the content, or am I doing this because I think it's cool and I can make an article for a list apart out of it? And we need to be focusing on our designs and making them actually communicative, and focus on doing things that actually have a purpose that make people's lives easier. And we shouldn't be creating things that are potentially going to alienate other users, like the Dingbats article. Because at the core, design isn't about showing off. This isn't about going out and getting laid. This is about actually solving real-world problems for real people, and we need to be cognizant of that. So design is really creativity for communication. So it's taking those ideas of art, that creative spirit of art, but applying it in the direction of actually something that's useful for communication purposes, for accomplishing tasks. And communication is a bidirectional thing. How many of you like to have a one-sided conversation? That one person who just talks and talks and talks all about them. It's not very fun. Similarly, there probably aren't many of you who really thoroughly enjoy sitting down and watching a movie in a foreign language that you don't speak without subtitles. It's not a really good experience. But a lot of times we create those sorts of experiences on the web. We create something that's impenetrable to somebody, and we should avoid doing that. So this is where empathy comes in. Empathy helps us to communicate better with people. So empathy comes from the Greek word empathia, for a state of emotion, and the kind of longer definition is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another without having the feelings, thoughts, and experiences fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. So to go back to the macaque story, the macaque was actually able to empathize with the person who was picking up the peanut and putting it in his mouth, and he had the same neurons firing in his brain. So that is empathy. And empathy requires quite a bit from us. It requires us to listen. And this is something that I think is really important, especially within our organizations and within our teams. Actually listening to other people who have a seat at the table. It's usually a little bit easier on small teams where there's maybe 5 of you and designers are communicating constantly with developers and business stakeholders and so on and so forth. But when you get into large organizations, you end up with little fiefdoms, and everybody's kind of got their own agenda and their own idea of what it is that they want to do, and the designers don't trust the developers because they don't really understand what the developers do. And similarly, the developers look at what the design decisions that are being made and the changes that are being requested from a designer, and they're dismissive of those because they don't understand what the designer is trying to accomplish by changing a color from blue to red. They don't understand the motivation behind that and how that's going to help the user accomplish their task more readily or be able to read a passage of content more easily. But by listening and actually engaging with other people who are within our organizations and other people that we're working with, we can better understand what they do and have greater trust in what they're doing and their role in the design of our products and our websites. By the same token, empathy requires questioning. Asking, from the developer's perspective, asking, why are we changing this from red to blue? It seems like an arbitrary decision. And then the designer to explain that. Or similarly, if you're working with a client and they just freak out because you used orange in the design and they hate orange, why is it that they hate orange? Start to ask questions, probe a little bit deeper, figure out what the thing is, what the connection is. Maybe they were hit in the face by an orange ball when they were a kid and they're just always terrified of orange. Who knows? But understanding that allows you to better empathize with that person and to establish a connection with that person, which is really important for empathy. Additionally, empathy requires observation. A lot of us kind of sit back and we look at our Google Analytics stats and we think that we know who our user base is, and we don't actually get out there and see what our users are doing and how they're interacting with our products. We don't actually, even do something as simple as go to a coffee shop and sit down, put your laptop down or your phone down and ask if you can buy somebody a cup of coffee in order to spend a few minutes on your app or your website to see how they interact with it. But being able to observe people in real time helps so much with being able to understand their situation. Observation is really key, and there's only so much that analytics can tell us. And a lot of times analytics can get skewed too. Let's say you look at your analytics and you're like, well, we don't have any users that don't have JavaScript turned on. Well, does your analytics software use JavaScript? Probably. So if they don't have JavaScript, they're not recording analytics and you're not getting any data. And there's lots of things like that. People say, oh, we don't have, we have a really minuscule percentage of users that are on, some aging phone, BlackBerry 5 or something like that. So we don't need to support that particular browser and platform. But then you have to kind of ask the question, again, coming back to questioning, why would that be? What's the experience like on that BlackBerry 5 device? Well, if it's a shitty experience, there's probably a reason the person's not coming back and not purchasing anything from you. But in reality, there may be somebody who has, $5 million to spend buying your widgets that, just loves that BlackBerry 5. And getting out there and actually seeing who your customers are and getting to see how they interact with web services and how they interact with applications and websites and what they're looking to accomplish can really help you to design better to serve those needs. It requires a little bit of intuition as well because we need to be able to, this is again when face-to-face really helps, we need to be able to look at somebody and see what their facial expressions are, what their body language is while we're engaging with them because it can tell us if somebody is saying yes, but in reality they're kind of holding back and they're not telling you the full story so that you can then ask them and get deeper into the conversation with them and engage with them on a deeper level to have a greater understanding of them in order to be able to empathize with them. And then it also requires patience. This is something I've seen a lot. We've been working on a project that's been a massive one for the last year and a half, and there have been some really tough parts of that process of getting this website out the door. And there have been really tense emails back and forth, and it's really easy to read an email and take it as being bitchy or condescending or something like that. But if you take a step back and think about it, there's probably something that's causing that. It may be completely external influence. It may be somebody's just had a bad day. Maybe they accidentally ran over their dog, or maybe their kid's sick and they got no sleep. Or maybe they're just frustrated. And we see this a lot with users, with actual customers as well, that what may come across as just kind of an email bitching about our service or our website, there's something else going on there. There's some deeper problem that we need to figure out what the cause of that is, and kind of take a step back and not just be reactionary, but instead try to figure out the root problem in order to be able to address it and get everything moving along smoothly again. And really, perspective is everything. And we need to give people the benefit of the doubt because we don't always know the full story. So there was a great piece on National Public Radio in the US in 2008, and it was about this gentleman, Julio Diaz. And he was walking down the street and was approached by a would-be mugger, and the mugger asked for his wallet. And so Julio turned to him and handed him his wallet, obviously probably terrified, right? Because this person is threatening him for his money. But instead of just handing him his wallet, he handed him his wallet and then asked him if he could give him his coat. He asked him if he needed something else, because he knew that there was something that was driving this man to need money. And so he approached him not as somebody that was confronting him, was threatening him, but actually looked at him as another human being and made himself incredibly vulnerable in the process and said, "Can I help you more? What more can I do for you?" And the story, it still kind of gives me chills because it's so brave and just human. And what ended up happening is that he ended up having a conversation with the mugger, and he ended up taking him to dinner. And they ended up talking, and he ended up helping him in a more meaningful way than just giving him his wallet and then running to the police. He was actually able to establish a human connection with this person. And that's kind of crazy, because we always want to put up these sort of barriers to protect ourselves. We don't like to be vulnerable. But these shields, the ego and such, they only separate us from other people. They don't allow us to establish these connections with people, these deeper connections. There's a great quote from Sarah Walker Butcher that was on Pastry Box a little while ago, where she talked about empathy, and empathy begins with vulnerability, so that same vulnerability that Julio Diaz had. And being vulnerable in our work is terrifying. I was just talking with another presenter earlier, and those of us who get up on stage often have kind of that freak out moment about 10 minutes before we get up here, where we're like, holy shit, I'm going to be found out as a fraud. Like, these people are going to know that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. And even though you may be super accomplished, you may have been doing this forever, there's always that moment where you feel vulnerable. And that's okay. We should embrace that, and we should use that as a means of pushing us forward. And we need to trust that the people in the audience are not going to heckle us from the back, potentially. But that enables us to do better work. And the same thing goes in our teams that we work with. We need to be able to trust that the other people that we're working with not only know what they're doing, but they have our back. You never want to be in a situation where another member of your team is throwing you under the bus in order to look better to the boss or something like that, or make you look bad in front of a client. We need to be able to work together in order to accomplish great things. So going back to the empathy definition here, the other part of it is that empathy is described as simply the capacity for having empathy as well. We don't need to be able to directly have empathy, but we can experience it completely vicariously. And there was a great sort of group project that John Rawls, a philosopher who left us in 2002, came up with, where he would ask members of a group, sometimes these would be students, sometimes they would be church organizations and such, he would ask them to imagine and craft their ideal society, down to the minute details about how people interact with one another. They could create whatever sort of society they wanted, whether they wanted to be democratic, they wanted an anarchy, a monarchy, whatever. It was completely up to them and completely in their control. The only constraint he placed on this was that he told them that they could not know what position they would hold in that society. Just kind of, that's the twist, right? This is what, let's see if I can pronounce his last name, John Harsanyi, who's a father of game theory, it was what he called the veil of ignorance. And what Rawls found is that when you introduced the veil of ignorance, by and large, people gravitated towards more egalitarian societies, so where more opportunity was spread around and people were treated with dignity and respect. You ended up with fewer very caste-like systems. And people generally want to be fair, because if you don't know, you don't know your station in life in this potential society, you don't want to be old if they mistreat old people. You don't want to be poor if the poor aren't treated well, et cetera. And the thought experiment allowed people to essentially walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, to vicariously live as, or imagine living as somebody else within their hypothetical society. So egalitarianism, which is a concept that I'm really enamored of, is really empathy in a social context. And Jeremy Rifkin has a really nice quote about this. Empathy is about showing solidarity with others who have a one and only life on this planet, which sounds really touchy-feely for an economist. And he actually goes on and on to talk about it not just between people, but between people and animals and plants and so on and so forth. But really, it's just about being able to relate to somebody else and to show solidarity with them, even though you may not be experiencing the same thing that they are. And solidarity requires that communication to be able to happen in a real and open way. And communication is really what's allowed us to move from being familial tribes to being in larger religious groups, and then eventually move into nation states, and then into more of a global community. The ability to communicate has allowed for all of this. It started by verbal communication and storytelling, and then eventually we had the printing press, and so on and so forth, radio, television, mail in some ways as well. And then, of course, the internet as the ability to really democratize mass communication, international communication. And you look at things like the earthquake in Haiti, and within 3 hours of that earthquake happening, there was a global response to it. That's amazing. And that happens because of empathy. People were able to empathize with the people who had suffered this horrible earthquake in Haiti that had leveled pretty much everything. And we've seen this as well in Egypt and Syria and other areas where there has been kind of a global outpouring of support, or in some cases rage over things that have happened that we consider unjust. And empathy seems kind of like the antithesis of selfishness, right? But selfishness and having self-interest, it's a survival instinct. And in reality, it's kind of the thing that drives us to be able to be empathetic, because we see what would be our needs in somebody else's situation, and we're able to experience that and kind of have that empathetic moment with them. If we weren't self-interested, we would not be able to empathize. We would not have that function of the mirror neuron. So mirror neurons allow us to walk that proverbial mile in somebody else's shoes. And in our industry, we try to encourage empathy through things like personas. This is kind of the typical approach we've taken within the user research world. And personas can be really good. And they're, not every team can afford to send everybody out into the world to meet their customers or potential customers and talk with them and see what their lives are like and what their day-to-day experiences are. So user researchers go out and they collect this information and they create personas that then help us to be able to empathize with that person at a distance. We get to know a little bit about them and what makes them tick. But I've found that in a lot of organizations, personas kind of devolve over time. And this is because they need to be cared for and fed, and they need to be constantly touched upon as real people and maintained as living individuals. They can't just become a replacement for the user. And one of the ways that, or some of the ways that you can avoid personas falling apart like this is by making sure, A, that they're well understood by the team to begin with, right? That they're not overburdened by irrelevant info. Like, there's some things that we don't need to know about somebody. Like, we don't need to know that John's a size 13 shoe unless we're working for a shoe company or someplace that sells shoes. And we spend a lot of time kind of building these personas, and I think in a lot of cases, people who are paid to build these personas want to create the best, most detailed and such persona that's out there, and it's so exhaustive that it's too much for other people to actually be able to take the time to read it, fully understand who the person is, and be able to empathize with that person and continually empathize with that person throughout the development of a product. What we really need is something that allows us to have more specific situational empathy. So that's where user scenarios come in. This is something that we've been talking more and more about in our own work. And instead of looking at the person kind of in isolation, we actually look at what their surroundings are and what's happening with them right now. Because design is problem solving. We're there to try and help the users accomplish whatever it is that we're trying to help them accomplish, whether it's to read something, whether it's to sign up for a service, buy cable, hook up their water service, whatever it is. We need to be able to help them do that. So what user scenarios do is call out the relevant facts. So in this case, we might have Bob, who's a mechanic. He's left-handed, and he wants to be able to look up parts information and potentially order replacement parts while he's under a car from his handheld device. So that's pretty specific, and we can picture ourselves in there. User stories do the same sort of thing, not usually so much in bullet points, but it creates a scenario that we can put ourselves in and really be able to empathize with this individual. And we only need enough detail to be able to put ourselves in that person's shoes. We don't need to know that Bob has a macchiato addiction. That's irrelevant here, right? We want info about his goals, his needs, his circumstances, whatever outside influences there may be, like he's under a car, distractions, the car is falling on him. We need to be able to know the limitations as well that he's experiencing. So, in this case, we're saying Bob's left-handed, so we need to be cognizant of what it's like to interact with our service for ordering auto parts if you're left-handed and not surfing primarily with a right hand. And user scenarios allow us to take this information and empathize with the user in a very productive way and to move forward. So where do we begin with our work? Well, the first thing, or the first way that I find that makes it easy to, or that's important for empathizing or demonstrating empathy for our users, is to set performance budgets. This is something that Jeremy and the folks at ClearLeft have talked about. Tim Cadlick, Brad Frost, who's also in the audience here, have talked quite a bit about setting a budget, essentially saying, here's the limit of how big our page is going to be, so that we're being respectful not only of our users' time for downloading, but also respectful of their money. Because if somebody's accessing your content over a metered connection, we want to be respectful of that. We don't want to be charging them, €7 to download a big file, a big image, because they happen to be on a Retina display. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Thinking about what we can do to cut down on the size of a page and then maybe enhance it in some way when we know that they're not on a metered connection, if we eventually have the ability to figure that out, which they are working on at the W3C, although I'm somewhat, I don't know, I'm uncertain that it's going to be useful, because we can tell whether somebody's on a metered connection, but let's say I'm on my Retina MacBook Pro, but I'm tethered to my phone that's on a metered connection. Will my Retina MacBook Pro know that I'm on a metered connection or not? If the browser sees that I'm on Wi-Fi to my phone, it may think, okay, this is Wi-Fi, and the site that's checking for whether I'm on a metered connection or not will give me a giant Retina image that I'm having to pay for on my phone plan. So, trying to make decisions that are actually respectful of our users in terms of performance. Also, thinking about our authors or our users and being respectful of them in terms of how they approach content, how they read content. Making sure that we're writing at the appropriate level, the appropriate reading level, using the proper voice and tone. This is something that Kate talks a lot about, and she's built a fantastic tool for MailChimp for helping them to better understand how to write for their users. But also we need to be able to approach our content with a realistic expectation of what our users, our customers' domain knowledge is, and making sure that we're authoring content appropriate to that. We need to consider physical limitations of users, not necessarily people who are using screen readers, but power users who prefer to work on a keyboard. Like if you've ever watched Jeremy surf the web on his laptop, he almost never touches the mouse. It's always on the keyboard. But when you're on touch devices, making sure that we take into account what that touch interface might be like. Trying to figure out how to strike a balance between touch, keyboard, and mouse when you're in something like a Windows 8 laptop that maybe has a touch screen as well as having a mouse and having the keyboard. What is that interaction like? How many different ways and mechanisms of interacting with the content do we need to support? Making sure that the text is legible, irrespective of the screen size, making sure somebody can actually read it. Making sure the buttons and interactive elements on your page are actually clickable with a finger or a thumb. And of course, keyboard access for people like Jeremy. And then also we should make it easy and satisfying for users to be able to accomplish the tasks that they come to us for. It's really easy to just put something up and say, oh, somebody can accomplish task X, but is it easy for that person to do that? Are they filling out a 12-page checkout form? Or could we simply speed that process up for them and give it to them in 5 fields? Do we need to have this huge long address thing, or could somebody, could we simplify it by allowing somebody to hit a locator if they have geolocation in their browser? Or could we allow somebody to put in simply their zip code and then automatically fill in their city and state, or if you're in the US, or their postal code here and fill in the province and such? And mobile first actually, as a concept and as a driving philosophy, asks us to kind of focus on those tasks and make them easy and make them accomplishable and reduce the distractions, reduce the clutter, and really focus on the core purpose of our pages. And I think that's a really important way to approach our work, and it really does demonstrate empathy with the user. We're not, creating a shopping cart form that has, umpteen different cross-sells and things like that. We're trying to help somebody actually, give us money. And we should make it easy for them to do so. We don't want to create unnecessary barriers. This is something I've been harping on for a really long time. People who create these wondrous JavaScript frameworks that when you load up a web page, the web page has an empty body tag, and then JavaScript loads in all of the content after the fact. Well, what's the experience if your JavaScript has an error in it, as the Gawker Media Networks did when they first launched their JavaScript platform? A developer had accidentally put an error into the code, and nothing was rendered onto the page. They had the logo for Lifehacker, for instance. Eventually they upgraded this, and they had the logo and a loading bar, or a loading spinner rather. But no content was actually coming in. And that's a bad experience, especially considering they're a blogging platform, essentially. I mean, they're news, but there's no content in the content. There's no there. So making sure that we don't put up these unnecessary technical barriers to actually being able to access the content that people want to access, just because we think it's cool. Also, not assuming that we know what the user wants. We see this all the time, people who throw up these interstitials. Hey, you're on our site on a mobile device. You probably want the app instead. I don't want to install an app for everything. I just want to be able to look up information. So let me look up information. But we see this all the time in other areas as well. Retina display images is another one. Why not give a user a choice? I've seen one example. Brad had actually found one of a site that was doing this, where they would actually ask, they'd say, hey, it looks like you can do a retina display image. Would you like to do so? Would you like us to load retina images? Are you satisfied with your lower quality image? And I think that's great. I'm not sure I love the implementation because it was an interstitial pop-up like this. But I think having like a little switcher on the images and then storing that information in a cookie or in the session or something like that for that user's time on the site is a really good idea, and then giving them the ability to turn it off again if they wanted to, because they might be at home on their iPad or something like that. They're like, oh yeah, sure, I'll take the big, beautiful photos, but then, bless you. But then they go out, for coffee or something like that, and they're on their mobile network, and they're like, no, I really want to turn off retina images now because I want to save that. I want to conserve the bandwidth. I want to be able to download the content more quickly, et cetera. And we should, basically this all comes back to letting the user control things. To go back to the olden days of the web, let a user change their font size. This is a really fundamental thing, and it has to do with just the availability and the accessibility of content. Accessibility in the grander scheme, not necessarily assistive technology accessibility. But we should also empathize with people who do use assistive technology. And if we're building complex interfaces, tabbed interfaces, sliders, and the like, we should employ technology that can help them better understand those interfaces, like ARIA, which is the Accessible Rich Internet Applications spec. We should be wary of how we're hiding content. So using display none and several other hiding techniques actually makes that content inaccessible to people who are using screen readers. And then we should use JavaScript to simply enhance the experience. It shouldn't be a fundamental requirement for the experience or for being able to have any experience. The experience should be good regardless. And then we should finally give users the benefit of the doubt. We should help them learn to accomplish complex tasks and reward them for doing that. So I think this is the one that I really want to show an example for, and that's Layer Vault. Layer Vault is kind of a versioning tool for Photoshop and such. And basically what they've done is within their interface, they're using what they call progressive reduction. And so as you get more experienced using the app and interacting with particular things, they begin to diminish the interface. So the signpost drops back to a little white box with a checkbox in it when you've used that for a while. And then it diminishes even more. So it gets out of your way and lets you focus on the things that you actually need to focus on, because this is simply telling you that this particular item is a signpost within the interface. But then the really brilliant part about it is that they're tracking individual analytics on your use of the app, and if you don't use a particular feature or you haven't been to the site for a certain amount of time, they begin to go back up the scale again, depending on your level of usage, or disuse rather, in order to make it more obvious to you again, because they know that your memory degrades over time, and that you may need a reminder, and then it will again diminish back, which is kind of an interesting concept. But really all of this empathy and all of these ways that we go about creating better experiences for users, it all comes down to one thing, the golden rule. And this was something that my grandparents taught me from a very early age. And I grew up in a Christian household, so it was do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But this is a very universal thing. We see it in Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, et cetera. And it's just the concept of treating somebody else with respect, treating them as another human being. And that's really what we should be striving to do here. And that's what I think what really led me to the idea of progressive enhancement as an approach to web design, about starting from a core experience and then building that experience up as you would build from a peanut to a chocolate-covered peanut to a candy-covered chocolate peanut or a peanut M&M. It's about creating better and better experiences. None of these are bad snacking experiences, but a peanut M&M is a hell of a lot better than a peanut. I don't think anyone would disagree there. My tummy doesn't disagree. But creating sites with progressive enhancement allows us to follow that idea of the golden rule and create appropriate experiences for users, and to really rise to meet their needs. Ben Ho has this fantastic quote about progressive enhancement in a blog post that he wrote that was actually more about politics and political systems in relation to progressive enhancement. But progressive enhancement keeps the design open to the possibilities of sexiness in opportune contexts, rather than starting with the quote-unquote whole experience that must be compromised. So we're building up experiences for users in order to be able to meet users on a wider variety of platforms with a wider variety of needs. And it's all just about being smart about the choices that we make in order to be able to create a better experience for them, because we should be empathizing with them, and we should be seeing our experience and our websites and our applications from their perspective in order to build better things. And coming back to egalitarianism, it's about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. So a lot of people will kind of rail against egalitarianism, thinking that it's like communism, where you're just leveling the playing field across the board and people can take advantage of that system, et cetera, but it's not. It's really just creating opportunities for people, creating opportunities for sexiness, and then allowing people to start off on a level playing field and end up where they need to end up based on their capabilities. And that's really designing with empathy. Thank you very much.